In this video, we're going to talk about After Effects' large set of painting and masking tools. First, let's talk about painting. Officially, painting tools are designed to clean up footage, and I'll show you how to do that in just a moment. But we can also use those same painting tools to create interesting motion graphics as well. I have here basically just a black solid. I want to paint some paint strokes on it. Now, in order to paint, we need to be in the layer panel, not in the composition panel. So I'm going to double click the layer to open the layer up in its own layer panel here. Now I'm going to select the paintbrush tool from the tools panel at the top. Because auto open panels is checked, the panels associated with painting automatically pop up. We could also make them hide or show by clicking the panel icon here in the tools panel. Also, if I go to the workspace dropdown at the top of the interface, you'll notice that there's also a paint workspace. So I'm going to click on that. And now we have a workspace that's very conducive to painting. Notice specifically I have a composition panel open here on the left-hand side. So as I work in the layer panel, I can see what my overall composition looks like as it's affected with my paint strokes. Now, if you're familiar with Photoshop, probably the first thing you'll notice about painting in After Effects is just how similar these tools all look and feel, and how similar the settings are to Photoshop. However, be aware that behind the scenes, what's going on there is very different than Photoshop. In Photoshop, paint strokes are raster-based. You cannot scale them up infinitely. They are based on pixels. In After Effects, they are based on vectors, so you can scale them up without any loss in quality. They also remain very editable and animatable, as we'll see in just a moment. Now, I first want to select a color, so I'm going to go over here to my paint panel and double-click this foreground swatch and select a vibrant color like blue that will show up better on our black solid. I could set the diameter settings, or I could use a brush tip preset. I could also adjust roundness and a few other of these settings. We're going to talk about those more in just a moment. Note that these panels only control the settings of paint before you actually paint. After you have painted, you need to go down to the timeline to adjust paint strokes you've already created. So I'm going to go over here and start painting. Now, I could also use a handy shortcut if I want to dynamically change the hardness or size of my brush. I could hold the Control key on the PC or the Command key on the Mac and click and drag to set the size of my brush. And then if I let go of the Control or Command key but still hold my mouse button down, I can set the hardness of the brush. The distance between the inner circle and the outer circle that you're seeing here is actually the feather. So this would be a relatively small feather. As the circle gets smaller, we have a relatively large feather. Now I'm actually going to just select a smaller paintbrush here, and let's draw a little squiggle. Now, I realize that that's not much to look at, but there's a lot we can do with this little squiggle. Let's go into the timeline and see what options we have. You'll notice that once you create paint on a layer, it actually is an effect, and it shows up under the Effects submenu in a layer. Open up the Paint drop-down, and the Brush drop-down, and Stroke options, and we have a lot of the same options that we have over in the panels on the right-hand side of the interface. The difference, however, is this little stopwatch. So again, this paint stroke is completely editable and animatable. I can go over here to the Tools panel at the top and select the Selection tool and click on my paint stroke and actually move it around. I can also come down here to my stroke options and play with these a little bit. I can animate the start, for example, so that my paint stroke kind of animates on or off. I could change and even animate the color. I could also change the diameter of the paint stroke after the fact, which is really helpful. If I decide later that I'd like a softer brush, I could take down the hardness. Now, roundness is kind of an interesting property. As we take down the roundness, it flattens the corners or the edges of our paint stroke, giving it more of a flat look. This is helpful for creating looks like ribbon. As I click in my layer panel here, off of my paint stroke to deselect it, you can see that these edges are a little bit flatter, and it does kind of look a little bit more like ribbon. I'm going to take that back up, actually. Now, an interesting thing to keep in mind about paint strokes is that they're basically just one single shape repeated a bunch of times. Specifically, it's the brush tip that you use to create the paint stroke. So as we take up the spacing, we'll space out these little circles, and you'll see that the brush tip I used to create this stroke has actually been duplicated a bunch of times. When we reduce the spacing so that they're very, very close together, it looks like one cohesive paint stroke. As we scroll down more, You'll see that we have additional options for opacity and flow, and we also have basic transforms as well that apply only to this paint stroke, such as position and scale. Now I want to show you a few other options here in the paint panel, but it's grayed out. The reason it's grayed out is because I have the selection tool selected and not the paintbrush. Once I select the paintbrush, all of these options become selectable again. Now when we created this paint stroke, we had the duration set to constant, but there are also a few other options as well. We could select right on or single frame, for example. If we select constant, like I did initially, then this paint stroke will be constant from frame to frame. Right on will automatically animate the paint stroke, and single frame will only have the paint stroke come on for a single frame. Let's see what right on looks like. I'm going to actually change my paint stroke to differentiate it from the paint stroke I already have. Let's make it red. Let's just make another little squiggle around this one here. Now as I press the spacebar to preview it, we can see that it automatically writes on. I could also go select the selection tool and move this into place so we could see it a little bit better here. Let's try that one more time. And there it goes. Notice that moving the paint stroke into place didn't change the animation at all. Now, as I mentioned before, the utilitarian purpose of painting tools is to clean up footage. So let's go over to my derailleur retimed comp. Let's change the workspace back to the standard workspace. So looking at this composition here, I might want some more of these beautiful blooms here on the left-hand side, these beautiful highlights. I might want to paint over this metal a little bit to add some more of that highlight. So we'd actually double-click our footage, select the paint tool, and paint here again in the layer panel as before. So if I wanted to paint with this beautiful highlight color over this metal edge over here, I would want to make sure that I'm using this exact same shade of white. To do that, I can hold the Alt key just like in Photoshop to temporarily toggle the eyedropper tool. I could then click my mouse, and I'm using that exact color of white. I could then paint and cover up that footage or clean it up as I please. Now you'll notice once I let go of my mouse that the paint stroke completely disappears. The reason why that is because the paint panel is remembering my last setting. The duration was set to right on. But what I actually want is constant. I want this to be constantly on. If I play this back as is, we'll see that that paint stroke animates the way I created it. I don't want that to be the case. So I'm going to hit Control-Z or Command-Z to undo that. And I could change this to constant and then paint on this area as before. And then I go from frame to frame and that paint stroke remains there. So this is all well and good, but an even more powerful tool for cleaning up footage is actually the clone stamp tool here again at the top of the panel. The clone stamp tool, just like is in Photoshop, works to sample data or content from one area and paste it to another. I'm going to Control-Z or Command-Z on the Mac to undo that paint stroke we had. And as I play through this footage here, you'll notice that we have a chain, let me go back to home here, that's kind of out of focus. Then we have a chain that's very out of focus. Then we have a chain that's very in focus. Now, if I wanted to clone something, let's say this area right here, I could just hold the Alt key and click to sample that area, and then come over here and paint it just like in Photoshop. I'm going to actually undo that. The real magic, though, of the clone stamp tool in After Effects is that we can copy and paste or clone and stamp from frame to frame. So I'm actually going to Alt-click to sample this chain while it's in focus. I can then go back to the out-of-focus chain and paint over it. Now, to do this accurately, I'm going to use some help in the Paint panel. I'm going to turn on Clone Source Overlay, which will allow me to see the source of my clone. If I were to paint without the overlay on, I'd kind of be painting blindly. So as I put my cursor over this footage now, I get an overlay of what I sampled from. So I could use this to align the chain, and then paint, and voila, I now have an in-focus chain. To see that clearly, I'm going to go back to my Paint panel and turn off now the Clone Source Overlay. And as you can see, we've now painted the in-focus chain on top of the out-of-focus chain. Notice as we go back a frame, we see the out-of-focus chain. With the duration set to constant, paint strokes are constant, but they only come in at the frame that you initially paint them on. Now, no pun intended, but let's switch gears a little bit. Let's talk a little bit about masking. I'm going to close my layer panel here. We don't need to do masking in the layer panel. We can do it in the composition panel. And let's make a mask on this movie clip. Now, when we create a mask, we use the same tools for creating shape layers. The way that After Effects knows that you want to create a mask as opposed to a shape layer is that you already have a layer selected. If you don't have anything selected, it will assume that you want to create a brand new shape layer. If you do have a layer selected, it will assume that you want to create a mask on that layer. So I can click the rectangle tool, for example, and come here to my composition panel, and with my footage layer selected, click and drag. And the default behavior, as you'll notice here, is to add the content of the mask and to delete everything outside of the mask. So if we just want to use one area of our video, we can do so using masks. Now let's take a look at our mask options. I'm going to go down to the timeline, and when we first create a mask, it pops up at the bottom of the timeline. Here we have the name of the mask. Now I can change the default behavior of the mask by going to this drop down here and changing it from add to subtract. So now our mask actually cuts a hole in our footage as opposed to deleting everything outside of the mask. Now there are other mask options. If I open up this mask property here, by clicking on this arrow, we'll see that we can feather the edge of our square, and we could also expand it beyond the mask or inside of the mask. I'm going to take this back to add here, and what we can do is actually animate the mask path. So I'm going to set a stopwatch for mask path. I could come out a little bit more in time here, and I'm going to use my selection tool to click and drag a marquee around these 2 points. Solid points indicate that the points are selected. Hollow points means that the points are not selected. We could pretty much drag these anywhere we want. Drag them up or down to the side. As I hit the home key, I can preview this animation. And you can see that After Effects automatically interpolates between the two shapes for us. When creating masks, we can also use the pen tool, the add vertex tool, the delete vertex tool, and the convert vertex tool to create more advanced and sophisticated masks.